Great. Well, welcome back. The idea for this session was really to talk about both the instruments of internet governance, but also issues. And we thought we'd start with some work that Patty and I have been doing. We'll do a kind of a tag team presentation, really about major issues, and then we'll come back to at least a proposal that has been something we've been working on. Again, the idea is what are some of the issues and instruments? Again, this is the basics. We know why the internet is difficult to govern. It's obviously transnational. It's complex and dynamic. Some of the things we'd like to do conflict. We'd like to have security, but we also like to have privacy. Those are not always easily compatible. We know that national cultures surrounding the internet differ quite a lot. And as we'll say more later, Patty will say more later, we know that obviously the ideologies of the different countries differ. I tend to think, when I think about this colloquially, I think that the American attitude toward the web is let her rip. The European attitude is, well, we'd like to control this, but we're not quite sure we can. And the Chinese attitude is, we're going to control this just like we control every other medium. Wolfgang got us very much into the geopolitics of the web, but it is obviously bound up. One of the things that struck us as we work is that even mundane things like where data centers are located turn out to have political and geopolitical significance. And we talked in our last session a lot about the tension between governments that want to kind of control things, and even democratic governments want to mostly run it, versus the private sector that wants to let it run free. When I look at the change in international relations over the last 50 years, what strikes me is really the rise of the private sectors, how important the private sectors are. We know that these big tech companies are geopolitical actors in their own right. I would dare say that Google's probably more important as an international actor than, say, Spain, or pick your country. In any case, it's a very different geopolitical context. In some sense, our as we alluded a little bit to in our last session, our international arrangements tend to be multilateral among states, and unevenly or with difficulty represent the powerful private sector interests. That's been the theme of ours as we've tried to build the Global Technopolitics Forum. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. So Greg alluded into differences in terms of ideology, but as you can see in this slide, we have quite a difference from where internet started, which was basically in Silicon Valley with the motto of data wants to be free. It was a bit of anarchist point of view. And then, of course, Washington started to take over. The idea there is that, okay, internet needs to be free. It's a market governance style, but needs some regulations here and there. And then it's Brussels' attitude, which they want to ensure privacy and transparency, but also they want to regulate the internet. And then, of course, it's Beijing's paternal internet, which is likes to control the system. Then we have Moscow approach, which is more of a strategy than really ideology, which is using the internet for disinformation and basically works as a spoiler. Greg mentioned that how geopolitical scene has changed, but we can see how the role of internet has evolved over the years. And from a very positive and being just a technical issue, it has become now embedded in every aspect of our life. And then some of the problems that was not envisioned have come to fore. For example, we know all about the disinformation and manipulation that took place during Brexit and US election. We now know that China creates digital corridors, which are concerning as a strategy to influence other countries. Now, militarization of cyberspace was discussed by Wolfgang. Of course, there's extreme amount of hacking going on, which is concerning. Then we know that internet plays a critical role in sanctions. And now innovation goes further, and we see that the architecture of internet itself is under question. We now hear about war of browsers and new forms of decentralized architecture, while internet is decentralized, but the core of it remains centralized. And now we can see with blockchain, there are some sort of attempts to turn that even to decentralized system. So it is a evolving and dynamic context. Over to you, Greg.
Just a reminder about digital corridors, interesting development, particularly China trying to build the digital Silk Road. It's obviously of interest to us all. That plays into issues about 5G and the role of Huawei. As you know, there's been a big controversy with the United States saying that Huawei is a security risk. Push that argument on everybody, including South Korea. And that obviously has direct bearings. It's one of the other big players in 5G is Samsung. So it's a issue, obviously, very much for South Korea, but more generally, the question of will there be a kind of digital corridors and what would be the implications of them? Not all bad necessarily, but we're thinking about. These are some of the geopolitical concerns. I'll look forward to our Korean colleagues saying more about them, but obviously there are geopolitical concerns that are national, that are regional. This is a look at the region. And there are also the international geopolitical concerns, which, as I said, range from high politics to rather mundane things like where data centers get located.
Discuss some of the concerns that we have in terms of geopolitics. For example, we talk a lot about privacy, but collective privacy with emergence of smart cities becoming a big concern. With collective privacy, I mean surveillance society, Orwellian society. Another concern is innovation. We don't want to impact it in a negative way, but innovation certainly needs guidance and leading. Another important concern is fragmentation of internet. We know that Russia already have created alternative system. China has its own firewall. We know that other countries are erecting borders around the data. As a result, we could see global trade contraction, which is not a desirable outcome. Sovereignty and autonomy is another issue, which since data has become an asset and since source of power has changed and data has become an asset, this issue has become an important aspect. And increasingly, countries like to safeguard their data. There is a potential for a global conflict as critical systems are becoming digitalized. Finally, there are concerns about world order, increasing influence of China into global system and into some of the standard-making institutions, for example, even in United Nations. Standards and compatibility, leadership of internet all become critical issues for world order and cause of concern. Internet holds solution to many of our problems, but it also presents new challenges. So challenges that we face are, there are various challenges from privacy to trade, to content, to intellectual property, security, and more. But for this discussion, considering the limited time we have, we decided we will focus only on 4 issues: privacy, content, trade, and security. So over to you, Greg, to discuss privacy.
Thank you. We could spend a whole dialogue on any of these. On privacy, what strikes me, interestingly enough, is that the 2 main pieces of legislation so far, and neither one has been done by a nation state. Obviously the most important is the GDPR in Europe, and then there's the California Consumer Privacy Act, one done by the European Union, the other by a state. They are obviously quite different in principle. The GDPR requires citizens to opt in. The California Act lets people opt out. trying a lot of emphasis on the right to be forgotten and have access to what data is known about you. And then it does get into questions about data localization, since countries, again, back to the dispute between countries and the private sector, countries would like to have access to data on their citizens, no matter where it's collected. All a big challenge. We know about privacy, and it seems to me that here that privacy issues are only going to get harder as more and more data. Imagine when we all wear 12 sensors that are very useful in monitoring our health, but how do you realistically opt in or opt out in that circumstance where you're collecting so much more data on you? I think that's a big challenge for everything. So far, the GDPR has been kind of the model for other countries, and that's good. But I worry about what happens when the amount of data that gets collected on us just gets so enormous.
Really, when we talk about regulating content, the key difference is what we want to regulate, who should regulate it, and how it should be regulated. So, like all other aspects of internet, the challenge in regulating internet is that innovation is very fast and legislation is very slow. A good demonstration of that is the Section 230, which was agreed in 1996, I believe. Yes. Various versions of it was also approved and or launched in different regions, different countries. And a couple of years sooner or later, they were all revisited and changed. So Section 230 basically gave online content provider broad immunity from lawsuits for words, images, videos posted on their websites. Now, over the years, there has been grievances from both sides of the aisle in United States. Republicans do complain and claim that internet providers, platforms, censoring their point of view, while the Democrats claim that it has become a place for manipulation, disinformation, and modeling in election. Both sides want to revisit this regulation. There are proposals right now waiting in Senate to limit the immunity of the platforms. Europe itself had a e-commerce directive in 2002, then Digital Service Act was introduced in 2020. Then we see France, Germany, UK, they all again revisited original ones, trying to limit the freedom, limit the immunity that was given to these platforms. India is another example. In 2000, it provided immunity, and then 2008, 2011, 2018, it has been revisited and constantly limited. Then China is another story. Again, the internet in China in 2010 provided a degree of immunity, but then now it has been revisited in a later date, and now not only platform owners should censor their content, but also they are expected to produce some positive discussion on information about the government. We know that in China, Constitution gives right of freedom of expression, but then under the banner of limiting the government secrets, which is poorly defined, many content is censored. So as I mentioned, the question is what needs to be censored, who should do it, how it should be done, should private sector take over, should we legislate it, and to what extent we should do. So in some countries, they expect platform owners to be responsible for this. Then it's a matter of how, for example, in some countries, it's a matter of 24 hours. Again, there are differences even when the 24 hours is introduced, whether it is from the time that it was 24 hours from the time that they were informed, or it was flagged, or various flavor of it in different countries is at the moment at work. So then I like also to bring to your attention that even platform owners like Mark Zuckerberg is now placing ads and trying to encourage legislation. So the question is why a platform owner wants to limit its own freedom. The other issue to think about is, as you all know, Twitter and Facebook censored a sitting president. So the question I like to pose is, what implication, regardless of how we may feel about that president, but what kind of implication it has for our democracy when a private sector could censor a sitting president? Should platform have the right to make a decision on content or be able to go to that extent? So over to you, Greg.
Just one more word on content. What strikes me is, at least in the big tech platforms that we know of, they're in this untenable position where they can no longer say, we're just platforms, we have no responsibility for what happens on us, but they're not willing or probably not even able to say, well, we're publishers and we take responsibility for everything that's on us. So we get back to the set of issues that Pari mentioned. Security, obviously, it's an enormous issue. We've seen the huge hacks in the United States last year. It's an ongoing problem. Probably in our case, we have maybe spent too little effort on defense, but it does run through everything. We could spend an awful lot of time thinking about it, but it does obviously range from hacking done as in the solar wind case, done by Russian intelligence agencies, through the Colonial Pipeline, which, as far as we can tell, was a ransomware attack that came out of Russia, but was not necessarily, still unclear, not necessarily sponsored by Russia. They actually even arrested a couple people from it, and we know this is growing. So the range obviously goes from most of the hacking, which is for criminal purposes, through things that are essentially cyber espionage, where the effort is to get inside and get information. The problem there, as with solar winds, is espionage is espionage until it isn't. Once they're inside the system, then espionage could quickly become something worse that destroyed something or took systems down. So it's an issue that obviously is going to get more and more attention. It ought to, I think, in our view, be more the subject of international discussion. We ought to begin to think of at least kind of confidence building measures on the Cold War analogy. If we could get to some rules of the road, that would be great. Probably no country is going to want to sign up to an agreement that bans cyber espionage, but maybe we could get to a point where there's some agreement that major attacks on infrastructure ought not to happen. In any case, that's a frontier out there that we really need to get to.
So with that, on that note, I turn to trade. Traditionally, source of power has been geography and territory, but increasingly it's shifting to data tech and technology. Data has become a sovereign asset, and with that, data flow across borders have become important global trade issue and subject to the existing global trade system. That system, GATT, and later on WTO, was created after World War II to promote global prosperity. GATT reflects the conviction that free trade will result in global good. It succeeded in bringing the tariff from 40% at the start to 5% today. The WTO governs 4 global trade agreements: the tariff, the trade in service, intellectual property rights, and investment. These treaties predate the internet era and have no direct reference to the digital ecosystem. Over the last few decades, not surprisingly, digital trade has become a major part of trade flows. a joint Huawei-Oxford economic report found that the digital economy is now worth about 11.5 trillion globally, equivalent to 15.5% of global GDP, and has grown 2.5 times faster than global GDP over the past 15 years. So today, what constitutes digital trade varies depending on which country one examines, and the absence of a globally agreed on definition of digital trade means there is also no set of international law to govern it. And that key issue are treated differently in different trade agreements. This historic focus of trade policy has been visible barrier like tariffs and quotas, but many internet and data policies represent non-tariff barriers. In this image, if we look at the right side, we see that there are different colors. The stronger colors represent where non-tariff barriers exist in relation to digital issues. For example, you can see Europe has a strong color. That's the result of GDPR, which discouraged some platforms from entering to the region. So therefore, it's regarded as a non-tariff barrier. Non-tariff barriers come in different forms. For example, barriers to internet services. There are localization barriers, technology barriers, investment barriers. For example, investment restriction, duty on digital goods and services, localization barriers are already mentioned, data localization, comprehensive privacy requirement to use local technology, sharing IP with local companies. These are hallmark of China. And then of course, that creates infringement of intellectual property. Then technology barriers, restriction and use of encryption, again, cause IP issues. Sometimes even it goes as far as requirement for IPR transfer, local certification, they're costly. And again, they raise concern on IP. Then it's cyber security threats, weak IP regulation, they all create non-tariff barriers. And that's a major issue right now when it comes to trade. I like to stop there, considering we don't have much time. Over to you, Greg, to continue.
Like this is really a statement of the problem. I think it's run through our conversation, and that is we have this patchwork of privacy laws, self-regulation, and lots of implication that perhaps it isn't good enough at protecting global citizens' privacy, and may even drive an escalation in geopolitical tension. In case we saw from, I think, virtually all the presentations, especially Olivier's, that there is really a plethora of institutions doing different things, some of them mostly intergovernmental, some of them incorporating the private sector, some UN, but it's a pretty incoherent and I think well described as a patchwork. And that seems to us to be the challenge we ought to take on, lest we find that geopolitical tensions become inevitable. This is really just, again, another way of saying what Olivier said, that there are lots of different institutions and organizations involved doing different things and maybe different pieces. So the questions are, what obstacle do these groupings face, and how do we find adequate mechanisms capable of achieving the right balance? Again, for us, I think that goes back to our issue about stakeholders, where we find how do you blend the challenge that governments will always want to have a significant role with the fact that most of the action, most of the innovation, and even most of the infrastructure is in private hands. That, I think, is the challenge we face going forward. And that's takes us to at least our contribution to this debate. Back to you, Patty.
Thank you. The premises that we have worked upon is that the global architecture, which was formed after Second World War, is not up to the task to deal with the current challenges. There is a need to bridge this existing global architecture to the new geopolitical context. And for that, we feel that new mechanism is required. We have come with the idea of Digital 20 or D20. It's a new initiative launched by the Global Technopolitics Forum, aiming to fill this void and to function as a bridge. Builds upon the important work done by Bretton Woods Institution and the Funding Internet Organization and other think tanks in establishing international codes and standards, as well as demonstrating leadership. The concept is still in infancy. In many respects, it's modeled on the G20, with the new group broadening the scope of the dialogue to newer stakeholders and digitally mature ecosystems, and shifting a focus to the key geopolitical challenges caused by the emerging digital technology. As an autonomous group with no executive power and no binding decision, our primary impact lies in creating trust and peer-to-peer intimacy among members as they develop a shared diagnosis of potential problems and a common analytical framework in a small, intimate convene. And on that note, I'd like to now turn to our next speaker.
Great, thanks. Now to you, Younglun. Will you say a word about yourself at the beginning of your presentation? And thank you.
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Youngjun Jeon, and I'm a lawyer at the law firm of Logos in South Korea. Firstly, I'm honored to be given the opportunity to make my presentation today. I'd like to show you key instruments relating to IP and privacy and trade from Korea's perspective. In particular, I would like to say that there is a conflict between privacy and trade in Korea and worldwide. Privacy means information privacy or the personal data protection. Trade mainly refers to digital trade. I think that how to resolve this conflict between privacy and trade is important issues. Bilateral negotiations such as FTAs and multilateral negotiations such as international treaties are useful tools to solve these issues, and such work is currently underway, I think. Let me start by key instruments regarding intellectual property. From a Korean point of view, there seem to be no special geopolitical issues in IP-related international treaties. However, it is still meaningful to point out that the IP is a useful weapon for advanced countries to secure international markets. The basic international treaties that Korea has joined are as follows: Paris Convention for Industrial Property, Berlin Convention for the Copyright, and WIPO Copyright Treaty, and so on. In the field of the trademark law treaty and Singapore Treaty, the amendment of the trademark law treaty. As a procedural rule of international application, there is a PCT, the Madrid Convention, and Hague System. Therefore, Korea is a signatory to most major IP international treaties. Let's move on to the next issues. And Korea has signed many trade-related treaties, such as TRIPS agreement, Korea-US FTA, and Korea-EU FTA, and RCEP. And the number of the FTAs exceeds 20. The Korean government is also considering joining the CPTPP, DAPA. DEPA is very intriguing. It is known to address data protection, cross-border transfer of personal information in depth. And TRIPS and FTA have greatly changed the rules and legal framework of Korea, including IP legislation. For example, patent law dealing with the pharmaceutical field and copyright enforcement practices have changed a lot due to the Korea-US FTA. And then I'd like to continue to explain the international instruments related to privacy in Korea. Sorry. Recently, the most important event in Korea's data protection practice is the adequacy decision of the GDPR from the EU Commission. This adequacy decision allows Korean companies to transfer data subject to personal information from EU to Korea without any additional safeguards. This decision does not cover personal credit information, which is subject to oversight by the Finance Services Commission in South Korea. This decision only applies to the jurisdiction of the Personal Information Protection Commission, the only supervisory authority for data protection in Korea. Moreover, the South Korea is participating in Convention 108 Plus of the Council of Europe as an observer. The EU GDPR has a great influence on Korean legislation. South Korea should comply with the additional safeguards and representation, assurances, commitments ensured in Annex 1 and 2 of this decision. As I mentioned earlier, there will be changes in data protection legislation in Korea due to the impact of the GDPR. EU seek to supplement the Korean-EU FTA by adequacy decision. EU Commission said, and quote, an adequacy decision would complement the free trade agreement between the European Union and the Republic of Korea that entered into force in July 2011 and was the EU first trade deal of this type with the Asian countries, unquote. Practically, Korea is expected to refer to the GDPR when revising the Data Protection Act. The EU Commission shall evaluate the application of legal framework every 3 or 4 years, where the EU Commission has indication that an adequate level of protection is no longer ensured. The Commission should inform the competent Korean authorities, and if necessary, it may decide to suspend, amend, or repeal this decision or limit its scope. Next slide. Let me tell you about the phenomenon that has been discovered recently. The tort law and competition law have influenced the IP and data in Korea, because the traditional intellectual property rights system cannot properly respond to rapid changes in society. And there is a need to protect idea, reputation, credit, and work performance that present intellectual property right cannot protect. As the scope of unfair competition law has extended, the new type of IP rights can be protected by competition law or tort law. Recently, legislation has been enacted to protect the data or data assets from the perspective of unfair competition prevention. It is named as data industry promotion. Now I will discuss the expansion of extraterritorial application of domestic law. Laws with extraterritorial application provision are emerging in Korea's legislation. This provision is like, quote, this act shall apply to any conduct done outside Korea if such conduct affects the domestic market or user or consumers in the markets, unquote. Examples of these laws are Antitrust and Fair Trade Act and Telecommunication Business Act and the Information and Communication Network Act. As a similar system, provision of designation of domestic agent, which seems to be referred to the representative provision of the GDPR, was introduced. These rules include the Personal Information Protection Act, the Telecommunication Business Act, and information and communication network. I think the designation of domestic agent provision complements the extraterritorial application of domestic law. This is the finer and important issues, the conflicts between privacy and trade. Apparently, emphasizing privacy hinders trade based on the free flow of data, and emphasizing trade hinders data protection of data subject. And privacy, along with the national security, may cause the data sovereignty and data localization. For example, the China's Network Safety Act, Data Safety Act, and Personal Information Protection Act, which is recently enacted, recognize the central government's supervision and regulatory authority over data, which make it mandatory to preserve important data in China. This will result in data localization. And there are concerns about foreign LEA, law enforcement authority, and public institutions' access to data for purposes of law enforcement and national security in Korea. These concerns may lead to the data localization policy too. However, the Korea-US FTA has local presence and transfer of information provision. Local presence stipulates, quote, neither part may require a service supplier of the other party to establish or maintain a representative office or any form of enterprise, or to be resident in its territory as a condition for the cross-border supply of services, unquote. Transfer of information stipulates each party should allow a financial institution of the other party to transfer information in electronic or other form into or out of its territory, unquote. Therefore, due to these regulations, it is unlikely that the data localization policies were established in Korea. Lastly, this is my conclusion on these issues. I'm of the view that we need to consider a global privacy agreement. However, it seems that the EU approach is favoring privacy over the trade, and the US approach is promoting or prioritizing trade over privacy, I think, are very different. Which approach is desirable for Korea is a main issue in the Korean discussion. In the case of Korea, there are some limitation in court remedies, such as the absence of a discovery system and unfamiliarity with punitive damages. So the tendency to rely on administrative measures and criminal punishment in data protection area seem to be greater than in other countries. Since each country has a different importance, cultural background, and the sensitivity to privacy, it will be difficult to create an international and uniform treaty on privacy. For above reasons, not all the stakeholders can be satisfied, but it is inevitable to reconcile privacy and trade on a global scale. This is all the time I have for today. I hope the presentation has been at least informative, if not entertaining. Thank you again, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was very informative, particularly for us, those of us who don't know a lot about the Korean circumstance and Korean law. So thank you very much. Now the plan is to have a bit of a roundtable discussion led by Professor Pak, and we have I think a commentator, a designated commentator to start us off. Over to you, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for fascinating presentations by Greg Perry and Youngjun. Why don't we start off with reactions to or comments on these presentations from our designated discussion Jian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chion Chen. I'm a legal counsel for OpenNet in South Korea. So my primary area of law would be we're focusing on making the internet a more free and open place for everybody. And a lot of the times that ends up touching upon areas where human rights converge with the internet being open. After listening to Greg and Perry's presentation, we focused on 4 areas: privacy, content, trade, and security. And I think Mr. Chun had a very fascinating presentation that focused on privacy and trade. So if I may, I would like to briefly make some comments on the content aspect of an open internet. So as our general main topic of today's discussion is about internet governance in Korea, a lot of the times when we talk about content restrictions in Korea, it does feel like that there is a general vibe where regulation tends to be based on a more paternalistic view, and in a view where it's more catering towards national interests. So a lot of the times that ends up resulting in content being regulated for the benefit of what the government deems more appropriate for the societal common good, and that ends up making the internet a little bit more of a difficult, less open area. And so I guess my general comment on that would be that because there is a general societal consensus on that it being okay that the government has a more paternalistic view on content regulations, we end up with cases where access to internet websites on issues such as women's reproductive rights, abortion pills, access to abortion pills, and those areas are just taken off the internet, and people within Korea are not able to access those information. So in that realm, I think it is very concerning that the governance tends to view a more paternalistic view of internet regulation to be more favorable in current Korean society. So I think that part of internet governance should be something that civil society litigators such as myself should be wary on and try to keep pushing back on. So that was one thing that I would like to add to our key area of conversation today. And yes, for now, I think that would, yes.
Okay, well, back to Greg and Perry. So you've made interesting observations on what is happening. Now, Eungjun, Mr. Jun has made a proposal to consider a global privacy agreement. What do you propose, Greg and Perry, to address these concerns and phenomena?
Well, let me start and other people can jump in. It would be great if we could have a global privacy agreement, but given the differences in view across countries, it seems to me that's sort of unlikely. I mean, so far we've got the GDPR as kind of the template that many countries, though not China or Russia or others, have adopted. But our commentator did pose that I think the really central issue about content, and that is, if we think content ought to be policed, who does it, right? In our case, it's mostly been self-regulation. We know Microsoft has created, or I guess we now call it Meta, has created a board of international advisors to give advice. But in the end, as Fadi said, the decisions made by Mark Zuckerberg about whether or not to kick a former president off Facebook. So the big issue, I think, is if there's going to be regulation, who does it? Do we leave it to the companies? So far, that's mostly what we've done. Other countries, including Europe, I think, Europe's more prone to do government regulation, and that sounds like the inclination in Korea as well. But I guess I think it would be wonderful to have a global regime for privacy. It seems to me unlikely, given the different. Now, maybe we can imagine a regime that's common across most of the democratic countries. And there it seems to me GDPR is sort of the template or the model that lots of countries have used. Going beyond that, I think, does get into these really hard questions about who does the policing.
Unless Perry wants to add anything.
Actually,
go ahead, Perry.
Yes. I want to add something to what Greg mentioned and the question that you posed. I think reaching a global consensus is almost impossible, but I think what we eventually I am hoping to reach is layers of agreement. So the core would be similar, but have different flavors in different countries and different places. For example, we will have a core of understanding on what is universal rights and in terms of privacy for citizens, and then add layers to it. Also, I see that in coming years, there is a role for civil society. I think the role of civil society will increase, as we saw that they played a voluntary role from beginning of internet. I think it will be stronger, it will be more formal, and that's the role I see. And in fact, our idea of D20 is on those lines.
Do you see GDPR as a common platform through which we can standardize privacy regulations around the world so that free flow of data, at least among the countries that have obtained adequacy decisions from EU can take place, at least among those countries? I mean, is that something that I can answer that question myself and then see what other people say, because the court interpreting GDPR has dismissed the US EU privacy shield agreement as exempting from the GDPR's strictures or GDPR's restrictions on the flow of data between over the Atlantic. So that means I believe that is still in negotiation to see whether EU and US can obtain a new privacy shield agreement that meets the GDPR standard. So from that experience, we know that the standard is very high. Or maybe the US has not been doing so well. Or at least there's a huge disconnect between them two. Having said that, this attempt to reach international agreement, I think will become more and more contested. So if anyone wants to disagree with me or wants to jump in here on the discussion, you can do that. Otherwise, I'll move on to my next controversial question.
Well, I think I agree that the difference between the EU and the US is pretty big. It still seems to me that GDPR is probably the best game in town. Now, how widely applicable can be and whether we can work out, if the US and the EU could work out something, that would be a pretty powerful template, it would seem to me, for at least those countries like Korea and others that are part of the democratic world. But as you say, so far pretty far apart, and the United States is not doing terrific at this. But I think the GDPR is an incentive to do better.
I want to add something as well. I think that we should also pay attention that the geopolitical context is very dynamic, constantly changing, and alliances has impact and influence on every policy and legislation that will come about. So currently, I think alliances is becoming stronger than it was even a year ago. So those will have impact, and we have to see how they will play their role.
And the sad aspect of the strengthening alliance is that the motivation for the strong EU-US alliance actually are coming from terrible things happening in Myanmar, terrible things happening in Ukraine. Yeah. I mean, in peaceful times, I think EU and US will be fighting over privacy regulation. So I hope that we can have peace on all fronts instead of conflict in one region, generating alliance in the other. My question is, I find it ironic that as we characterize flow of information between cross-border information flow as trade, we are losing a lot. We are creating motivations to restrict the flow of information. Before the internet age, if I send a letter to another person, say in the US, that was not considered trade. If I make a phone call from somebody in China, that was not considered a trade. Now, the internet, the platforms, say YouTube, Facebook, Google, a lot of what's taking place here is taking place on free basis, and meaning there's no fee for, it's a simple exchange of information that is really taking place, just like the phone calls and exchange of mails, snail mails in the pre-internet age. So a lot of this push to free that flow comes from human rights. And that is not, that, how should I say this, that flag, that flame of human rights is missing from the discussion by characterizing this availability of internet services, availability of online platforms as trade instead of just communication. So I think that a lot of different conversation can take place if we focus on the fact that much of the, I wouldn't say the same thing about, for instance, Netflix traffic, because that is a proprietary information that you are paying for. But a lot of other communication is just simply, free, unpaid, non-paid communication. And as we characterize it as trade, that becomes, as you know, all the free trade agreements have exceptions to exercise of sovereignty for the purpose of protection of life, health, etc., which does not easily come in to the human rights regime. That is one question. The other question that, I let you choose between the two questions. The other question or statement that I want to put out there is the US response to China. I think it has a mutually escalating effect. Yes, Russia and China have instituted data localization, and in response to that, for instance, the Trump administration tried to ban Huawei equipment from the US soil, have tried to ban TikTok from US soil. Now, those are also forms of data localization in a sense that the location of data matters. Now, if you do that, that will justify, for instance, Trump's attempt to kick TikTok off the US soil will have a rationalizing effect, will have an escalating effect on other countries instituting the same restrictions on cross-border data movement. I'll just put those out for discussion and want to see anyone wants to respond.
I think you're surely right that the things that Trump wanted to do have that effect, do encourage other countries to do the same thing. And so that's obviously, as you think about the costs and benefits of a particular policy, that's got to be weighed as a cost. On your first question, I wonder, is there something fundamentally different about information in this age, in the sense that if you sent a letter before, nobody expected to learn anything from it. Now all this data that we have moving around has enormous commercial value. Companies are using it to target us for advertising and all sorts of things. And I wonder if does that make it in a different category for you than previous information, which seemed purely communication and personal. This now seems, because it's the more of it there is, the more valuable it is. It seems to me to be more of a commodity, which has value, than just sort of ephemeral communication.
If I may jump in, I think that data becomes valuable when it's big data. And
Right.
that phenomena, we didn't have it in past. In past, it was always about a small data. It's just in the internet and information age that suddenly we're dealing with this big data, which becomes a trade issue and have a value. So that's one comment. The other comment I have is on the second question. I want to inject a dose of optimism, because yes, there are this escalating situation between superpowers, but at the same time, the response is mixed. There are a lot of avenues for collaboration in issues of environment, in pandemic, in science. So while, yes, there's escalating situation, but economies are too interdependent.
If I may add on to that, to the first question, I think we definitely know that the internet has helped immensely in spreading information, making us little people be able to spread out the word to anybody who's willing to listen. But also, when people approach information, I believe that they take different what they want. What they want from it is a little bit different. For example, from my observation, it seems like the United States in its culture has utilized information in more of a commercial sense, whereas China has viewed information more as something of societal value, where they use information to keep, if I may say so, it's people in check. So your facial recognition data and everything else that goes into your social scores and social points, right? So when we talk about information and its effects and its impacts, when we think we're talking about the same thing, but also we come from vastly different cultural aspects. So with that in mind, I think going back to internet's inception and why it was so important and so powerful, impactful for democracy is that it makes people gives a voice to people that we could send the word out there. So like Professor Park said, we tend to forget about the human rights aspect of the internet and information because we get consumed with all the other important areas like security or IP and all of those things. But I guess as a legal counsel working for a nonprofit in a civil society, it makes me very passionate when I talk about information, because it's something that could really, really help human rights in many, many areas. But also at the same time, it could totally go the other direction where control information could impede on people's human rights. So it's very important. All the discussions that are going on today are very important, but I think it's very important also to refer back to the individuals and their human rights and how all of this internet governance ends up impacting those people, especially people that are marginalized in society.
It's always intrigued. I was going to say, it's always intrigued me that even between the US and Europe, there's such a difference about attitudes toward privacy. Europeans are relatively comfortable with having the government know things, but not very comfortable with the private sector. We're the opposite. We're quite happy to have all these big companies know all about us and target us for advertisements, but we're concerned about the government knowing much about us. It's a very different, I guess this goes back to one of our early points about the differences in culture that are really quite important as we think about the web.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add something. The collective participation is what gives value to internet. Without it, it will be a technology like any other technology. The magic is people and their participation and their ability to be. So internet inevitably has to cater to people as time passes.
Yes.
Let me ask one thing. It could be very naive, but very pure technologist perspective. Well, as you guys mentioned, you only talk about geopolitics and so on. But there's, I think it is some kind of unbalancing between users and the this information mediator or the curator. It's like Google, Facebook, and all those things. Initially they open up the marketplace for users to exchange information, and then they try to leverage that marketplace for advertising purpose. So they actually they're making money. So in that sense, well, people didn't actually realize how Google made money, right? But still they provided lots of good services. So it's okay. Now, I think the not only just kind of marketplace, but also industry realized the people's exchange data is essential tool for reading market trend. So it's more value. So now, as a user of the Google or Facebook, well, I know they provided a great service for free, but they actually making more money. Now they're selling my information, right? Not as the marketplace. So they put a board on this certain specific product while I'm using their product. It's fine. That's I have my choice. I can see, or I just kind of simply ignore. But behind the scene, they actually leverage my information and then let them read what I'm going to buy in the future. So as a return, I don't get anything. Right. So I'm not the business person, so I don't have any marketing, the background, but this is commonsensically all the products actually some kind of balancing. The producer set up the price, and then the users actually shows that their agreement or disagreement. Because if it's too high, they don't buy, and if it's enough, good enough, and they'll purchase. Right. Okay. But here we don't have anything. So I'd like to ask how we actually give certain marketing or pricing structure in this very unbalanced situation.
Well, the idea is that you are using free services. You are using Facebook for free. And what Facebook is doing.
My question is, it is the good enough.
Sure.
As we say, if you don't pay with money, you're paying with data.
Yes,
paying with personal information.
I think what you're
saying is more valuable than the service that I get.
I think then we need free market. So that's where antitrust laws comes in. So if we have a lot of services, then we will see who provides better service. If it was really a free market, then it was justified. But right now, we are condemned to choose between big platforms because there isn't any other service. So it's an unfair market created by these big platforms, giant techs, and any small business, they buy it right away. So they're all, absorbed into these big platforms, and we don't have a choice. It's not really a free market acting.
Actually, exactly. That's my point. I think that the economic aspect of, yes, there is a more than communication going on. There is a commodification going on, but that economic aspect has to be segregated from the communication aspect. So that economic aspect can be dealt with antitrust law. Europe came up with a DSA recently. That's all good. But the communication aspect is different. I mean, digital trade is happening not from communication, but by selling the forum, selling the eyeballs who are using the forum to advertisers. You know that 90% of revenues from Facebook come from advertising, and so is Google. So trade is not happening through communication, but trade is happening by uploading advertisers in exchange for the service of uploading advertisers banner on the on that forum. I think what I see as a problem is we are commingling communication aspect and this trade aspect, and we are all lumping all aspects of the internet under trade agreement and try to solve it there. I think that we have a lot that we can expect from DSAN and other antitrust regulators on the unequal or asymmetric aspect that Dongman has suggested, but that should be different from restriction on the flow of data itself. Data localization, other data sovereignty measures. They are, I think, shooting up the wrong tree. I'm barking up the wrong tree. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, it's 5 minutes past the time. I need to go. I know that most of you need to go, but I know that I spoke a lot in the roundtable discussion. So if anyone wants to say something in 1 minute, I'll give you a chance to speak.
I have one question. As for the global privacy norm, I have found that U.S. MCA, U.S. Mexico Canada agreement recommended that CBPR, cross-border privacy regulation of APEC, is the role model. Recommend the role model. What is your take on that recommendation? What do you think about that in the from the perspective of US?
Gosh, I confess I've heard about that, but not much more. So I don't. I'm afraid I can't say much. Forgive me, but you'll make me look into it. Thank you.
Okay.
We all know that there are really fierce fights between the privacy advocates on the value of CBPR versus GDPR. So if any treaty mentions it, we should always take it with a grain of salt. Okay.
All right. Let me say thank you to everybody. This has been a great conversation and a great start for us, and we really appreciate the collaboration. And it's been great to do this with all of you. So thank you, and we'll look forward to the next time.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.